our panel today, let me also mention, we've got quite a bit we're going to try to cover, so I don't know if we'll have a lot of time for questions, although there is a half-hour break between ours and the next one. So that, but if we don't get to everyone's question, we are also presenting a panel tomorrow at 1 o'clock, and it's our, every year we do the Ask the Brony Psychologist. So you can bring any question you have about the Brony fandom, the meaning of life, anything. I always like to make a stab at that question. Yeah, although we prefer Brony related, but so tomorrow at 1 o'clock, it's not in this room. I think it's one of the others nearby. But so bring your questions to that too. And I know, and the thing I love about coming to BronyCon is I get a lot of people who say, "I remember you," and that. This is, I think, Marcia's 6th BronyCon.
How many have you been?
And my 7th.
Yeah.
I was at the original New York City, 850 people packed in a room about this size. You know, it was a hoot in that. So I enjoy BronyCon. I enjoy kind of seeing familiar faces. Also, we're going to talk about the issue of what our data is telling us about how the fandom is changing. We are finishing the book, the Brony book, so next year we will have it. Also, there's another project I'm working on, but I won't talk about that right now, a fiction book that also involves the Bronies as some of the characters in that. But I'm hoping to have that next year too. But let me just mention, one of the reasons it's taken longer than we planned, is we've had a success in that we've got so much data. 50,000 subjects, so many variables. And so it's a challenge to meld all that down, although we've found lots of significant things, although I can say pretty much all of them can be looked at in a very positive light towards the fandom. So the book is not going to say terrible, awful things about the Bronies, although we are going to talk about a few topics like Rule 34. Half the Bronies said, "Don't go there." Other half said, "Yeah, go there." So we have a chapter, mostly because there are going to be people reading the book who know nothing about the Bronies, and we need to introduce them, because if they go in looking for Pinkie Pie images, well, they better be careful. They better be ready. So, you know, you've got to inform people about what to expect in that. All right, so we're going to try to talk about two things. The first piece is the why Bronies are involved in cosplay, and that, you notice some of the questions on the survey you did asked about right now, you know, are you wearing t-shirt, how, and we call it fan display behavior, but we can also call it cosplay, especially when you get where you're kind of wearing full outfit. I was talking to somebody in a full fur suit, you know, that's the epitome of cosplay. But we asked sort of the question about cosplay, and particularly an issue of how is it involved with identity, okay? And we found some very interesting results. The Bronies are helping to answer some of these questions. Also, the issue about coming to cons, are you all your typical group of Bronies? And what you're going to see is, in some ways, you're not. You probably represent a subsection of the Bronies. As you might know, not all Bronies come to the cons or the meetups. And so we found some clear results there. The Brony Study, notice just Dr. Redden and myself are here today, but there are two other researchers. I think this was from a panel 2 years ago we did. Dr. Chad Bourne, who's now finishing his PhD at the University of Texas, and Dr. Griffin, a PhD social psychologist who wasn't able to make it this year. And then we also have Will and Jillian, our research assistants. Will's still a student. Jillian is out in the real world now. So I hope to see her into graduate school one day. But, I wanted to mention just real quickly, and this may sound a little bit like a university lecture, and I can't avoid that because that's what I do. But also because I look at these things as opportunities to educate you all about what we're finding, but also a little bit about being a social psychologist and being a researcher, because sometimes people have some real misconceptions about what researchers try to do. Generally, when I talk to my fellow psychologists, what you find is that there's two ways in which social scientists tend to view fandoms. And one of them, and this is perhaps the more common one, is they look at the fandom as a group of subjects. And researchers salivate when you say subjects. You know, if I mention, here's a room with several hundred people, they go, oh, let me have one. Because the biggest challenge in doing research, social science, is finding subjects. And particularly with the furry fandom, there's a group of researchers, Ryson from Texas, Planty from Iowa, and they study the furries, but they tend to look at the furries as a way to test other phenomena. So like look at identity. Oh, great, we'll use the furries. They're not studying the furries because there's something unique about the furries. They're looking at it, any group will do, sort of. That. So that's one way of approaching it. This yields what we call nomothetic data. It tells you about, you can compare groups, but it doesn't necessarily tell you unique things about how the Bronies are sort of unique. The second thing is you can study a fandom as a unique phenomena. In other words, you can say, here's the Bronies, and they are like no other. Or at least our assumption is they're going to be different from, say, a group of Raven football fans or a group of NASCAR car fans and that. So that's the second way. This is the one that you don't see quite as often. And although I do think social scientists are beginning to realize that fandoms are unique phenomena that can be studied by themselves. This is more of what we've done with the Bronies. So when our book comes out, the Bronies will be, by and far, the most well-studied, well-documented fandom. And the things we're able to say about you all, nobody else can say about any of these other fandoms, because they haven't studied the other fans that way. And as I was mentioning to a few people up here in front, we were so lucky that we chose the Bronies, because you all have ponied up, 50,000 of you, to take our surveys, whereas I was telling them trying to get League of Legends fans is like pulling teeth to get them, or furries, or South Park fans, and that. So the Bronies, you all have proven to be very willing subjects, and that has allowed us to do all of this research.
Not only that, but one of the really great things about that we feel that we have been just, almost blessed by this was that we got into it on the ground floor. We started our research in 2011, and the Bronies really started in late 2010. So we got into this on the ground floor and have been able to study the evolution of the fandom, as well as the studying the fandom rather intensively itself.
Right. Some of our early subjects were 4chan Bronies. Many of those are gone now, and we might say good riddance. In fact, we're going to see. I'm talking a little bit later. When we talk about what happens, most people think, "Oh my God, we're losing people." But one thing to realize, it's not always bad to lose people, because sometimes people don't necessarily fit with what the fandom has become or what the fandom preaches, love and tolerance. And so it can be good if people leave who do not necessarily fit, especially if they're going to go out and troll and give the fandom a bad name and that. So losing members is not always bad, although in general you don't want to be losing too many, and we'll talk a little bit about that. All right. And a note here is the Brony study, we've done both. In fact, the survey that you all filled out represents sort of that first. I could have looked at convention attendance, I could have looked at identity and cosplay, I could have gone with an anime group, I could have gone with any other fandom. So, but we used the Bronies because you all are willing participants. So we've done both also, although primarily the second group. All right, there are two questions that we asked at the BronyCon, the survey that you all did, basically looks at two things. One it's a question about identity status and cosplay. Identity status is how well-formed a person's identity is, and you'll see there's a couple of hypotheses about that. If you have a well-formed identity, do you cosplay, or are you less likely to cosplay? So that was one of the questions, and you'll see in a minute we've got our answer to that. The second thing, well, and this is meant to show you, and these are all, I just pulled them off the internet. The range of display behaviors, everything from wearing a t-shirt to dressing up, you know, as one of the characters, all the way up to having a full fursuit. So, and of course, there are some people, I look at you, and except for the badge, I would never know you're at a BronyCon because you're not wearing any fan display. And that's okay. That would represent a very low score on the cosplay and that. The second thing we were interested in, and we've been studying the Bronies since that first con, but one thing we had never done is we had never asked the Bronies at the convention to fill out a survey. All of our surveys are online, and as many of you know, they can be rather long. But that allows us, with those long surveys, we can look at so many variables in ways you can never look at if you just have, here, do this 5 minutes. You know, that. But one of our questions was, do we see a certain type of Brony coming to the conventions? Or are we going to find all of the types, social, secret, hidden, hipsters, mixed? And you'll see what we found is there's some types of Bronies that there's probably not a single one of them in this room. And probably half of you represent one of the other types of Bronies. So you'll see what we found is that Brony type does impact on who comes to conventions. That also has an impact on what people expect from the conventions and what the conventions need to try to provide. Because certain types of Bronies, I hear a lot of excitement about the Pony Palooza, you know. That kind of fits with one type of Brony. They're going to be the ones who can't wait for the music to start. I know that at the introduction they were pleading, you know, take a risk, get out there and dance in public. Certain types of Bronies, there's no question they're going to be doing it. So what works at conventions is going to be influenced in part by the types of Bronies that show up. For age, you mean? No, generally we range, and we run into problems. Technically, you're not supposed to use anybody under 18. We usually kind of limit it at like around 16. And then we typically go up to around 50. Now, we do get some older Bronies, but usually there's such a small percentage in the pool that we drop the ends just to sort of consolidate. Because sometimes a 75-year-old Brony may skew the data in ways that a 17-year-old Brony wouldn't. And then also the second thing is we will look at the issue of what does the data say about the state of the herd. And this is, I think since the very beginning, it's one of those questions that often comes up. It's gotten louder recently, not surprisingly, but I'm reminded back in 2012, Daily Dot, which was one of the online news sites that ran one of the very first articles, we were interviewed in it, in Daily Dot, and it was the most popular thing they had ever put on their website. And they just got real excited. The same person, about a year later, wrote an article about the demise of the fandom. The Bronies were dying. And I remember, and I looked at it and said, but you know what had happened? She had switched over to anime conventions, and she would run into Bronies at anime conventions. And I've talked to quite a few people who would run into Bronies at anime conventions, and most of them said the same thing. I don't like them. I don't like those Bronies. And I'm like, the problem is that the hipster Bronies, which also represent Brony trolls, often tend to show up at those places, and they don't care what people think about the fandom. In fact, they are happy if you think the fandom is made up of a bunch of deviants. And I think that that's what happened is she talked to those individuals, and sure enough, a lot of them were 4chan Bronies, and they were leaving the fandom because it was getting to be too popular. And as one one 4chan brony told me, these young bronies don't get it. Love and tolerance is a joke. It's a joke. And I'm like, you don't get it. It's no longer a joke. And that.
The other thing was that the population of the fandom was getting to be more normal, you know, more within the average range of what we see in non-brony fandoms. I mean, there's not a whole lot of difference between bronies and non-bronies. Yeah. And, you know, I mean, once something gets to be normal, whatever that is, and psychologists still can't define it, people, you know, they don't want to have anything to do with it anymore. They want to be standouts.
The hipsters do.
The hipsters. They want to be standouts. And being standouts and being a brony just did not match.
When it became, as it's become more and more accepted and the shock values disappeared, and this is something I mentioned about one of the changes in the fandom, is that they go away. When they come up to somebody and say, I'm a brony, and the person goes, oh, cool, my brother's a brony. That's not what they want to hear. That's not the reaction they want to get. And so they're probably going other places, finding other things that they can say to shock people. Although some of them might be espousing alt-right crap. And there's been recently someone pointed out, and Marcia actually is in Playboy. She's in an article they did on that question about, are the bronies a bunch of alt-right, racist, and neo-Nazis and skinheads? And it's like, where is this coming from? No, it's not. But see, one thing you have to do is you got to be vigilant, and you got to squelch these rumors when they come up, because you have so much evidence that that's not what the fandom is about. But, all right, let me kind of keep moving on here. The first hypothesis had to do with identity status and level of cosplay. This is a general phenomena, so this is something we could ask of anime fans or football fans. Last night, all those Raven and Redskin fans running around with their fan displayers. Most cases, they had jerseys on. I was happy to see a lot of them paired up. We went to eat, and there was a Redskin and a Raven eating together. It's nice to see that there's not that animosity that some fandoms have towards each other and that. There's two possible hypotheses with respect to this issue of identity. And one is that cosplay might represent a function of the fans' ongoing identity search. Especially adolescent and young adults are often still trying to figure out, who am I? You know, what am I about? And so one hypothesis said, well, maybe cosplay is a way of experimenting, you know, and trying out this character and seeing if they really fit me in that. So that's one hypothesis. The other hypothesis says that cosplay represents a display that the fan has an identity. In other words, they feel good enough and strong enough about themselves that they don't care if people see them walking around, you know, with a pony on their chest. You know, they feel comfortable with it and that. So one says you're busy searching and you don't know who you are yet. The other says the people who are displaying lots of cosplay may in fact have pretty well-defined identities. Mm-hmm.
I think that's actually how I came up, because when I was starting the fandom, I was really shy and nervous about expressing and talking to anybody. Now, I don't care. I'll go to the store and wear a pony shirt.
And see, what I would say is that from a process standpoint, well, and you'll see the data would say, is that as your identity forms, in fact, what happens is our results say the individuals, the more cosplay you display, the stronger your sense of identity is. In other words, people who aren't sure who they are, they're nervous, they're anxious, they're not going to walk around with a pony shirt on, because that's going to get them attention, and they don't know how to respond. But as you become more comfortable, as you develop a sense of who I am, and there is evidence, we've seen it with a lot of ponies, or bronies, a lot of bronies have said, being a brony helped me figure out who I was. It helped me find myself. And as you find yourself, you're comfortable displaying it to others, letting other people know about it. So this, I actually was a little surprised, because I tended to lean a little more towards the theory that says, you know, because we do know that teenagers who are trying to figure out who they are often, I had a student years ago with a teenage daughter, and she said, I dreaded the morning. Because she said, I didn't know who was coming down the steps. Someday her daughter would come down in her cheerleader outfit. Someday she'd come down with blue hair and be a goth. And she said, I just didn't know what that. Obviously, the daughter was trying on different identities. But what the data says is that the higher the level of display, the more two aspects of personality. The more the person found a sense of harmony in themselves, they felt good about who they were in the different parts. And they also tended to report having a stronger sense of purpose in their life and direction. Both of those are related to a stronger identity formation. Now, the interesting thing will be, at some point, to take this and see if we see the same thing in anime fans or in other fandoms. Again, it's possible that the Bronies are unique in that way. Or we may find that cosplay is a sign of identity achievement, irregardless of fandom. Mm-hmm. Oh, no, that's okay. Okay, so our answer was that identity achievement seems to make it more comfortable and easy for people to do cosplay. And it will be interesting at some point if we can find another fandom to test that and see if it fits for the other fandom. The second thing had to do with the Brony typology, and I don't want to get too much into the typology, although if you go to the Brony Study, we explain the 5 types of Brony fans. They break down based upon, do they find guidance and meaning in the fandom? The ones high in that are usually social or secret Bronies. The lower are the hipsters and the hidden Bronies. And then the second thing is, do they feel comfortable display? Are they comfortable telling people they're a Brony? Those represent the social and the hipsters. The ones low on it are the secret and the hidden. So your secret Brony really embraces being a Brony. It's very important to them. But I remember that very first BronyCon, somebody said, well, how do you know if you're a secret Brony? And I said to the group, I said, well, I don't want to see a show of hands, but I said, some of you are here and your family and friends think you're somewhere else, right? They think you're shopping or you're doing something else, or you came for the football game, right? That means you're probably a secret Brony. You don't feel comfortable enough in your social environment to share that. But the question was, so who's going to come to the cons? What types of Bronies are going to show up here? And our idea was those Bronies who find meaning and purpose and feel comfortable sharing are more likely to be here. And what we found was that, in fact, sort of what we had predicted, the social Bronies, who are the ones who are comfortable, often they're more likely cosplaying because you're walking around with a display saying, hey, I'm a Brony. But they also find meaning and purpose in being a member of the fandom. So almost half of the people who attended our presentation last year were social Bronies. About 30% were mixed Bronies, and they kind of represent, they find meaning and guidance, and usually they're comfortable telling their close family and friends, but they may not walk around advertising it to everybody. They don't have a big pony decal on the side of their car or something. But you know, they will share and tell with people. Then the next group was the secret Bronies, which usually make up about 30% of the fandom. They're less likely to be at the convention. But again, I think it's mainly because how do you find cover? I had a secret Brony years ago. He went to the New Jersey convention. And I saw him there, and I said, how did you pull this off? And he said, well, I told my mother I was at a New York City Comic-Con. And I went, okay, that sounds cool. Well, then he got home, he called me and said, uh-oh. His mom Googled Comic-Cons in New York City, and there were none that weekend. But she said to him, but there was this thing going on in New Jersey. And so he had to fess up to her and tell her he was a Brony and that. But so usually that, and then hipsters, there are a few around, but the hipsters don't usually come because they're not into this love and tolerance thing. They're not into everybody getting along, giving hugs, you know, that's not kind of, it's losing its shock value to them. And then the hidden bronies, I think I was, in fact, a little generous. I think there was only like one last time. And the hidden bronies, in any other fandom, hidden bronies would be not even called fans. They're what you might call the very casual fan. But the Brony fandom, one thing that's very unique about Bronies is that in order to call yourself a Brony, generally the idea is this. Watch the show, like the show, call yourself a Brony. You don't have to own the t-shirts, you don't have to go to the meetups, you don't have to tell anybody you're a Brony. So these are actually casual fans. Other fandoms would say, get out of here, you're not a fan. You don't have season tickets, you don't collecting the figurines. Leave, you know. But the Bronies make it easy for people to be in the fandom. And that's something that's unique about the Bronies, and it's also part of, I think, what makes you special. It's easy to get in, and if you want to leave, then you leave. But, I mean, they're not going to shame you about not, you know, buying the clothes and that. So the results basically support the hypothesis. 75% of the fans, and it'll be interesting because you all filled out the survey, and so we can look and see if the same thing kind of fits again this year, and that are about half of you what we would call social bronies. And again, this is unique to the Bronies, but I suspect, and I was telling someone a little earlier, that my suspicion is other fandoms also have typologies. So there are probably furry types, there are probably Raven football fan types. They're not going to be the Bronies, because the Bronies are unique because of that guidance function. But I do suspect there will be types of fans. And that'll be the challenge for some other social scientists to try and uncover that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the herd census back a few years ago had people do the Myers-Briggs, and they found some connections between some of the types. The one thing you have to, and I don't want to necessarily get it, you know, there are conflicts within the field of psychology, and sometimes they are involving certain constructs. And Myers-Briggs is a very popular construct, particularly with businesses and a group, you know, talking about sensing and feeling, and that's a. However, for psychology as a research area, it doesn't mean squat. We do not use it in our research because it's not reliable in the way that research needs.
The Myers-Briggs has not been revised in 40 years.
And that's suspicious.
And when you don't revise an instrument approximately every 10 to 15 years, you've got to really raise some questions about it, because society and attitudes do change. And if you're going to be using an instrument now in today's society that's 40 years old, I'm sorry. It's, you know, we just consider it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for using that term. I was going to use another one, but that's okay.
Yeah. Well, also, and I don't want to get sidetracked too much. This is actually a good question for us to carry over to tomorrow. But remember at the very beginning, I mentioned that you have nomothetic and you have idiographic data. Nomothetic are numbers that we like to say that they mean something in that they allow you to compare groups. They allow you to do statistical analysis. Myers-Briggs tends to give us idiographic data. As a therapist, I can find the Myers-Briggs to be useful. Also, personally, I like what it says about me, you know, and that. However, it's idiographic, which means as a therapist, that's great, but when you start sort of saying, well, let's compare different groups of fans, it's simply not scientifically valid and reliable. That's why we use other instruments. And there are some instruments like the MMPI that have been around for a long time, but they update it.
Yeah.
You usually update every 10 to 15 years so that you make it relevant. Sometimes they'd ask questions about, for example, one of the questions was, do you like to play Drop the Hanky? Well, do any of you even know what Drop the Hanky was? It was a game back in the 50s where you drop the hanky and see who picks it up. It was sort of like spin the bottle kind of thing. Well, that question would be meaningless now. So, you know, I don't want to diss Myers-Briggs fully because there are people who love it and therapists who make use of it. But as researchers, no.
You know, the other thing about therapists is that we are generally not so interested in personality types, in typing personality. But as therapists, we're usually interested in finding what the problem is and how we're going to solve it. And the Myers-Briggs does not give you any help with that. None.
In fact, one of the things about the Bronies in our book is going to stress this, and I think this is the piece that's going to make social scientists set up and take notice and go, what? Is generally typologies are viewed very poorly. Because typology makes sense to people. Oh yeah, I'm a creative type. But when you go in and do the research and say, can we predict what that means? It usually doesn't hold up.
But prediction in psychology is very difficult anyway.
Well, yeah. No,
you know, it really, prediction in psychology is about 50% at best, and 50% is the flip of a coin.
Yeah. Now, I mentioned that why you all in Brony Fandom is one of the unique things is our typology, which we created early using our factor analysis and with database, has proven to be so robust. On almost every dimension we compare Bronies, type matters at levels that I've never seen in research. So I think one of the things that the Brony Fandom is going to tell social science is that typology can have meaning if you figure it out. And in fact, the typology is based upon, are you open and able to express your interest, and do you find guidance and meaning in that? Now, I often say, I don't know that going and asking a Raven fan, I think I'd said somebody, asking a Raven fan if they find guidance and meaning, probably they're going to go, what? And that. But there may be a different variable that helps you predict that. But again, the Brony Fandom, the typology is so robust. I've been very pleasantly surprised. And I think that's going to create a little bit of a buzz in social sciences. Now, some of them are going to jump all over it and say it can't be, but because some of them don't think typologies ever work. But I've got the data, and they're going to have to look at it and say, and if the Bronies are unique, then that means there may be unique typologies in other groups.
And for those who are going to attack us about this, we're going to ask them, show me your data.
Yeah.
You know, we've got data. Do you have data? If you don't have data, well, we got a problem here.
When you say we got 50,000 subjects, how many of you?
How many of you got?
That quiets people. Now they may disagree with some of the statistical tests we use and that, but that always ends up happening. But we've got the data. All right. The second thing I wanted to mention here, and this has been useful for me to do this because this is the chapter on the book that I'm slogging through right now, and it's the question about what's happening to the fandom. And I think it's a critical question because it's one that people often ask, and I go on and I check the message boards, and there's always discussion groups popping up about the state of the fan. Are we dying, And as I mentioned, the person in 1912 wrote the article saying the Bronies are dying. Well, obviously, that was
They're not
wrong.
dying. She
Or
blew
2012.
she blew that one.
I had the 12 part right. So.
Yeah, she blew that one.
Yeah. When you do what I do, lecture and get in front of big groups of people, you have to be comfortable with admitting sometimes I'm a bozo and I'll say something wrong or something. But I want to talk a little bit about the issue of what's the state of the herd, and I want to review this rather quickly, but point out some of the, again, the data that we have that helps us sort of make an estimate about where we think the herd is at right now. There are three possible outcomes that you can talk about with respect to this question. One is you can have what we call the growth condition. And this is usually early in, and we're talking about fandoms, but this could be any group. It could be a new church. It could be a new sports fandom. We're now starting to study a college that has a football program for, this is its third year. So it's very new. It's very, and so they're in the growth condition. They're trying to get fans to come in. Oh, really?
No.
Talk with me afterwards, though, because I didn't realize that. No, this is, and, you know, did my eyes just light up? Subjects? No, this is Limestone College in Gaffney, South Carolina.
Not too far away.
Not too far away from Charlotte. And actually, the Charlotte program is probably much bigger. And in fact, actually, it's interesting because early in the spring, I saw a program on the local TV about the Limestone College, and I watched it, and I said, damn, they're trying to create a fandom. They were doing everything you would do to try and create the growth. They brought in an NFL person to be the coach. You know, they're just all this fanfare, and I'm like, we got to get in there. We got to look at this and watch this fandom sort of grow. So a lot of times early you get expansion, and if you've been around a little while, and I think it's true, between season 1 and season 3, there was an explosive growth in the fandom. You know, the BronyCon went from the first one I was at, 850, to the second one 6 months later across the river in New Jersey, 4,000, and the now famous fire that took place, to a year later up here, and we jumped to what, 7,000, I think? And then we jumped to 10, you know, and close to 11. So there's this explosive growth that took place. The second condition is what the stable condition, and this is where the fandom is kind of static. There's new people coming in, but you're losing people, but there's a balance. You know, you may be gaining a few more, you may be losing slightly, but this is also the condition that I look at and view it as when social groups begin to really mature, okay? In fact, actually, one of the things about the Brony fandom, and those of you who have been around for a while will remember this early on, I call it the sky is falling phenomenon. Twilight Sparkle, Derpy, the Equestria Girls. I mean, every time these things came up, people would say, it's the end of the fandom. And I'm like, guys, wait. The Equestria Girls came out. I went and watched it with some Bronies who were all upset. Never heard another negative word from them. In fact, a little while later, they say, what was it we didn't think we'd like about this? You know? So it's a maturing of the fandom. And then the other part is the decline. I keep looking at this clock and it's wrong. The decline condition. That's when the group is, in fact, losing more people than they're gaining in that. All right, let's talk about the growth condition. What is some of the evidence that we saw in our data? And again, since we started studying the Bronies early, we got to see some of this taking place. So the incoming gains are greater than the outgoing, and so the fandom is very much growing explosively. The Bronies, one thing that happened is everybody wanted to do a con, right? Everybody thought, we'll jump on the con bandwagon. Well, that didn't go too well. You can ask us about Las Vegas, because we were there.
We were there.
We were there. And, you know, the truth of the matter is you need to be more measured. You know, you want successful experiences. And so you can't just everybody run out and jump on it. One of the things that when it comes to the issue of growth, one of the things that we found is that there's a process of discovery, and some of you will know what I'm talking about right away, and I call this the conversion experience. It's the person, and I've talked to so many people who will say, all right, I'll see what this is about, right? 2 or 3 or maybe 4 episodes later, they're sitting there saying, damn, I'm a brony. You know, it's like this conversion. And of course, part of it is they probably have all of the disposition, they have the attitude, everything they need. They just haven't been exposed to the show. And this seemed to explain, because we ran into so many people who sort of said, in fact, one person I talked with was a troll. He hated the Bronies. He said, oh, the stuff I said about the Bronies and the stuff I did to their artwork, oh. And then he went and watched an episode, and then the second, and then the third, and then he realized, damn, he's now a Brony, you know, and that. And sometimes, interestingly enough, people who go through conversions, whether it be religious or whatever, are often the most adamant new converts. I mean, he started up a meetup, you know, after that happened. So mm-hmm.
When I was talking to somebody in line, who said before he was a Brony, he was cyberbullying on the internet. Then he found the fandom, and it basically just changed.
Yeah. We've seen that with a number of individuals. And again, what you have to think is he had some of the characteristics of your fans in general. He just never had seen. And how many people do that? Hate something they never actually, I know people who hate races they haven't even met. Hate religions and they have no idea what the religion's about, you know. So sometimes people hate things and then when they suddenly get exposed to them, it's like, wait. The second thing is the guidance function. This is one of the most surprising things about the Bronies. And then when I watched an episode, I realized the Brony episodes are parables. A parable has a moral message. It wraps it up nicely at the end. There's no doubt what the message is. And the early ones, when they would send the message off to Princess Celestia, I looked at that and said, what a vehicle, what a parable this was. And that. So that also meant that for some of the Bronies, this became, and this is where and we even had a T-shirt made on it, of the WWPD. And when I tell people that, what would a pony do? They go, what? Because they don't realize that these are parables. This isn't like watching Mickey Mouse or some other cartoon. Although I know maybe Mickey Mouse has a guidance function too, but not the ones I used to remember as a kid. And that. So that guidance function. We did some research looking at, and there's a theory about what's called moral foundations. And there's 5 different characteristics that most people base their moral decisions on. It explains some of what we call liberal and conservative. You also see it fall along religious lines. Interestingly enough, the Brony fandom felt a perfect match with one of the groups that these authors studied, and they called them the liberal religious orientation. And they said, these are individuals, they don't necessarily go to church, and they're not necessarily overly religious, but everything in their life they view as a moral decision. Every choice they make is a moral choice. Okay? There are some people who go through life, they don't even think about, am I hurting anybody? What's this going to mean to the environment? Doesn't matter. But what the Bronies as a group seem to fit is they seem to fit a group of millennials who think in moral ways. And it doesn't mean you're thinking religiously. It means you're thinking about what's the right thing to do. What's the right way to treat a friend? What's the right way to tell somebody bad news? You know that. So again, this was unexpected, and we haven't published that yet. I think when we do, the authors of moral foundation theory are going to get real excited because as far as I can tell, this is the first time we've identified a group that fits that so closely. Also, another phenomena that we discovered early on, and I named it the virus vector phenomena. And if you're familiar at all, my son Will, where's Will at? Oh, he slipped down. He always slips down. But Will is a microbiology major. And one thing about viruses is if you get a virus, who's also going to probably get the virus? Everybody you're close to. And so many of the early Bronies, in fact, it happened with Will. He discovered it by accident. He became a Brony, and within 6 months, all of his friends were what? Either Bronies or what I call Brony tolerant. You know, they knew the ponies, they didn't watch, but they were. And that happened, and that explains part of that explosion. Who are you most like? You're most like your friends. So people were discovering it by accident. I've talked to so many groups of bronies, 5, 6 of them, and they'll say, one of them said, it was Linda, our friend Linda. She came in, and within a week, we were all bronies. You know that? So the virus vector phenomenon. And that helps to explain why there was such an explosive growth at the very beginning. Also, there was the jump on the bandwagon. The bronies were the new thing. And now with social media, you know, whether it's a new game or a new cartoon or a new movie, a lot of times the buzz, and it gets a lot of attention. In fact, this next point, and I think politics has recently proven this, any attention seems to be good, whether it's positive or negative. So even having the trolls attack you means you get attention, and people will say, well, what's this about? And more people are going to watch the cartoon than would have otherwise. So that also helped to bring more people into the picture. Also, the meetups and the conventions, and this was interesting, and I've talked to a number of bronies that early on this fit, and they would say, you know, I've never gone to a convention. I've never done anything. I've never dressed up. I've never, you know, and until the bronies. And I remember talking with some anime convention people who had some negative views of the bronies, and I said, well, why are you so negative on the bronies? And they kind of said, well, it's because they've never been in a fandom. They've never gone to a convention. They don't know how to act. And I'm like, okay. Well, that's interesting. For many of the early bronies, this was the first time they got involved with something like this. So that newness also adds to the excitement.
Well, for some, we also found out through talking with some of the parents that, and I handle the emails, and I got this frequently in the beginning from both parents and from other therapists, that this was not only the first time that some of them had become involved with a group, it was the first time they had become involved with anything. And the love and tolerance and the acceptance made it, you know, really did facilitate their involvement and get them out of their shell and out of themselves.
Right. Yeah. We heard lots of testimonies.
We heard lots of stories.
I remember after at the end of the New Jersey convention, a father came up, shook my hand, and said, I've got to thank you. And of course, I'm like, what did I do? He said, well, no, my 16-year-old son was suicidally depressed. He was failing school. He had no friends. He was being bullied. The parents were just like at wit's end. And then he discovered My Little Pony. 6 months later, he's at the convention. He has friends. He's doing well in school. And, you know, they were like, it's a miracle. So those kind of things sort of tended, and in fact, one group in particular, and we could talk more about it tomorrow if you have specific questions, are some of the autism spectrum disorders, the Asperger's. There were a number of parents that sort of spreading the word, you know, send your son and daughter, because these people are accepting. They won't bully, they're tolerant. And again, that's not a common experience. That's a rare thing. So all of these things tended to lead to, of course, it does mean that the fandom has to deal with a certain amount of, I hear one of the names people will say, Bronies, just a bunch of Aspies, you know, like it's a derogatory statement. I'm like, I'm glad they're there because in one of the surveys we asked people if they have a diagnosis, and about a third of the bronies had some diagnosis, usually depression or anxiety disorders. It appeared that in our group, about 5% of them carried an Asperger's diagnosis, which is
much higher than the normal population.
Yeah, higher than the normal population, but I'm not surprised because, again, the bronies are a very safe place, you know, for them to be. Well, we just asked mostly about the Asperger's, yeah, because
Yeah.
it ran into the question of how to define some of the disorders.
You know, I mean, at that time, they were still working on the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, and they were having difficulties in defining autism. And Asperger's, as a matter of fact, is no longer a diagnosis, except in the state of New York, where the legislature says if you've got it, you can keep it.
Politics.
Yeah.
Well, I guess they let you carry it. I don't know if they're diagnosing new people with it.
No.
But I think what they were saying is if you
you've
had
got
the
the
diagnosis, you could
diagnosis of Asperger's, you can keep it. It's now called a social communication disorder. So, you know, but we were doing our research at the time, and, you know, now if we say something about Asperger's, people understand. If we say something about social communication disorder, people go, what's that? But, you know, if you see a difference between Dr. Edwards and myself, we're both clinical psychologists. Dr. Edwards went the academic route. I practiced. And that's why we see things a little bit differently.
We also have somewhat different backgrounds. She's more psychodynamic, I'm more humanist and behavioral.
We're also total opposites on every other personality dynamic you can think of.
One of the conventions a couple years ago, somebody got up and said, well, Dr. Edwards, do you and your wife, and our reactions were like, huh. We're each married, you know, but to very different people. We respect each other, we work well together, but we, you know.
Yes, you've had your hand up several times.
Yeah, that's the thing I've noticed about this fandom is it's just so open. It's very, it's positive. Like as an example, I'm talking to people, just random strangers, and I never would do this in like say a store or something. Just talking to these people like I've known them for 5 years, and I've heard people several stories, especially if you're in the military, it's a very stressful job. Where it basically saved their life. The show saved their life because it's drag them out of that depression.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've heard that too.
Not uncommon.
Not uncommon.
You know, in fact, there was a study that came out 1.5 years, 2 years ago, where they were looking at the issue of the importance of social contact. And it was interesting. What they found was having one good friend. If you have just one good friend that you can turn to and talk to, that's enough to save many people's lives. You don't have to have a big network. One good friend.
And in fact, you know, as a clinician, when I was evaluating a situation for, is this person genuinely suicidal? Because a lot of people come in and say, I'd like to kill myself. I mean, that's very frequent. But they don't always mean the end of their life. You know, they just mean, I want this problem to stop. There were 3 things that we looked for: faith, family, and friends. If they had 2 of those 3, then we considered them to be a very low risk for suicide. If they had all 3 of them, we considered it almost no risk.
So the fandom, I think, for some individuals, provide them with that, you know, that friend. And if you have a number of friends, like some of the Bronies who, in fact, I talked to Bronies and I said, why aren't you more involved? Why aren't you going to the meetups and that? And they're like, well, I already have more than enough friends, you know. So for some people, let me real quick, are we getting close to? Okay. Let me just real quickly mention the issue of stability. And let me say, this is where we're at. When people ask us, well, what do you think's happening with the fandom? I believe we're in this sort of stable stage. We're maturing. The size may be shrinking a bit, but again, and in fact, I have a little statement here. Oops. No. I have a little statement at the bottom of where I sort of say, remind yourself, it's not the size of the fandom that matters. It's its functions for the fans. So the more that it meets people's needs, the likelihood is that it's going to continue. What this mentions is that we did an exposure study. We took 400 people and made them watch the episode of the Flim Flam, the Super Squeezy 5000. And about 18% of them reacted in ways that might predict that they could potentially become bronies. Although the interesting thing we found, even those who said, I have no interest in watching the show, they shifted to a less critical view of the bronies. They became more brony tolerant. So if you can get people to watch the show, most of them aren't going to become bronies, but they may become more tolerant. Also, we just, and I had been talking a little earlier, we've been doing some research trying to understand why the bronies are so readily willing to volunteer, and yet I mentioned League of Legends. We've been pulling teeth to get those people, you know. And what we've come to the conclusion, we've got some data, I presented it at a convention in Atlanta 2 months ago, and that is that what matters is cohesion. If you like each other, high cohesion, and also if you're stigmatized. And the bronies are still stigmatized. People still say that the bronies, those two things make you more amenable to being a subject, especially if you realize we're not trying to make you look bad. You know, we're trying. The furries are also high in cohesion, high in stigma, but getting furries can be very difficult. But because the problem is the furries aren't centralized. They don't have Equestria Daily. Going and finding the furries is difficult, whereas the bronies are easy. League of Legends, no cohesion. They don't like each other, and they're not stigmatized. South Park, no cohesion. They're not stigmatized. And so getting them as subjects is horribly, difficult. Also, there are new sources of fans developing. Our subjects are becoming younger. Also, you see more of the target audience coming in, the younger females. And I wonder if the movie, everybody's get the hype, if the movie coming out might not lead to a spike in, the target audience. And one of the interesting questions for me is, in 4 or 5 years, are those young girls who are now, 7, 8, and like the show, are they going to disappear like most of them do? They get shamed out of the fandom, told to grow up, Or are they going to stick with it because the bronies are here? And interestingly enough, we did a study with the Disney Princess fandom, and what we discovered is most of the fans who leave the fandom don't leave because they're shamed. They leave because they grow out of it. And you'll notice one of the things, that's the second pattern, we call it aging out. The 4 bronies that I first interviewed, 3 socials and a secret brony, they were very involved. I went back and talked with all of them recently. They're all former bronies. They still say, yeah, I'll always be a brony, but they don't watch the show anymore. They're all either finishing college, getting married, starting careers. And so for some individuals, sort of being a fan no longer fits with, and I call this the merit badge phenomenon. My son, who was an Eagle Scout, has all of the badge. And it's like now you get a brony badge. But you go on and get your husband badge, and your father badge, and your other badges. And, again, some people might say, we hate to lose them, but that happens. I used to collect comic books. I don't anymore. I used to collect stamps. I don't anymore. So that's that sort of aging out. The other thing is some are leaving because the fandom, and we're finding this particularly with the hipster bronies and the 4chan bronies. They're gone. They're leaving. This is not the fandom they started with. And you often see this in churches. They first start, you got a core group. The church gets real big, and the original members leave because the music changes, the sermon changes. They don't know anybody anymore in the group, and that. So those two things we think are accounting for some of the loss. Although our sense is the new bronies coming in sort of are balancing. So right now we're in a stable place in that. We think that as long as Hasbro keeps making the cartoon, that the brony fandom will continue. And I personally agree with Pinkie Pie in the Will the Pink Pony Please Sit Down rap. If you haven't seen that, you've got to see it. It's a hoot. And she argues that the brony fandom will continue even once they stop the show because the brony artists are going to keep creating. And as long as you're creating music and artwork, that's going to continue.
And I also think that, you know, the Trekkies have continued, even though there's been very few Star Trek movies after the first one. That there's always going to be a group who are interested in it, who, you know, will go back and watch the CDs, who are going to go and watch it on YouTube. I think that there's going to be a core group that are going to continue. People will come in and then leave. But I think that this Brony thing is going to go on for quite a while, even though, you know, Dr. Edwards and I may have stopped studying it. You may have stopped attending BronyCon. I mean, BronyCon may be much smaller than it is now. There are all sorts of possibilities, but I think it will continue to some extent.
Yeah. Although, and the one thing we know for sure is it will change. Let me mention one final thing. Tomorrow, ask us about this. Because it never ceases to amaze me with studying that people will come up and in fact, Marcia was interviewed, and she's in the online, the Playboy article, about the alt-right, the neo-Nazis and Bronies, and it's like, what? Where's this coming from? You know? And so we'll try to talk a little bit about that tomorrow.
But my husband can now say that his wife is in Playboy magazine.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. Again, remember, 1 o'clock tomorrow.
1 o'clock tomorrow.
Bring your questions.
Bring your questions. We'll answer them all. We hold back nothing.
Yeah.